Good evening. It's Sunday night, so what's that mean? It's Sunday Night Live. Well, I'm a little tuckered out. It's been a long weekend. So I would promise you a short sermon, but we know that probably won't be the case, so we'll just forgo that part of it. But I did take Brother Billy back to the airport today. Thank goodness he flew into Flint instead of Detroit. And got to take him back there, and he said his words were something like, well, I'm not a spring chicken. So he was a little tired too, I think. But he said the same thing that every one of the speakers that I've brought in my time here, over 3 years we've probably had 15 guest speakers from around the nation come in who I think are some of the best of the best. And every one of them has left and remarked on what a fantastic church the Waterford Church of Christ is. And I don't just feel that way because of how you impressed Billy or how you impressed Mark Blackwelder or Hy Jones or any of the other great speakers we've had. But I feel that way particularly for being able to show you and being able to share you with all of those visitors that were here this morning. What a wonderful church family. And with that in mind, as you're turning in your songbook, I've been trying to teach you this song. I think it can become a theme song for us because this is how this church operates. Number 732. We're going to sing it in just a moment. But as we're doing that, I have a little commercial announcement. The government used to say, Uncle Sam needs you. And this call goes out to all of our sweet ladies here in the church. And we're saying, Bring, Teach, Keep needs you. Because if you fancy yourself a bringer, I think it might be a good thing if we were to shower all of our visitors with some cards and just notes telling them how much we love them being here. So I have 8 copies of all of the visitors from this morning. And if I could get 8 sweet ladies, you can come up to me afterwards. I'll hand you yours. Just write a couple lines. We love you. We're glad you came and hope you'll come back and visit. Just thank you for being here with our family or whatever you want to say. And just shower people and let them know. Don't you think that'd be a good thing to do? I'm going to call you something special too. You're going to be the card crew. Okay? Now we have a group that send cards to people who are sick and things like that. But this card crew, it'll be the bringer card crew that's thinking about those who visit and trying to shower them with affection and love. So if you'd like to do that, 8 copies of it here. If I get a whole lot more than 8, we have a copy machine. So I don't think we can probably do that too much. So if you'd come up to me afterward. How many are on the list? Well, you can't afford the stamps. If Don's family can't afford the stamps, who's willing to buy them the stamps? The Mungos are buying your stamps, Don.
I think it's 13.
Is it carpal tunnel? Is that the problem? Laziness might fit in. All right. Well, that's why I said the ladies. They're less lazy than we are. Number 732. I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. I've been washed in the fountain, cleansed by His blood, joint heirs with Jesus as we travel this sod. For I'm part of the family of God. You will notice we say brother and sister around here. It's because we're a family and these folks are so unique. How true is that? When one has a heartache, that down. I'm going to write some new verses. From the bowling team to the golfers. You know, from potlucks to Ladies' Day. I mean, we got lots of great stuff. For the bringers and the teachers and the keepers, they all stay. You know, whatever. So, turn in your Bibles. We're studying today, starting in Romans chapter 12. And we're going to take our time on Romans 12 because it's easier than Romans 11. And easier than Romans 9. And so we're going to take, and there's just so much here. And Mario talked about that being one of his favorite passages. Romans 12, 1 and 2. I mean, anyone who's striving for spiritual maturity is going to love Romans 12, 1 and 2. It is so rich, so full. But as we begin to talk about living sacrifices, I think an appropriate place to begin would be in Genesis chapter 22. Now, we're all very familiar with this story, although I don't know that any of us really wrap our mind around it. The offering of Isaac on the mountain by Abraham, the father of faith. We all know that Isaac was the long-awaited heir and son of Abraham and Sarah of their old age. They had waited and waited and waited. In fact, when God told Sarah she was going to have a child, she laughed at God. And it irritated God a little bit. And so she was temporarily punished for that. But in that, we see that, I mean, folks of that age, they just don't have children. Our daughter's going to have a baby, and we found that out recently and got to hear the heartbeat, and we know the date and all those exciting things. And Lenore and I were musing one day, well, what if we had another baby? And we just about thought that, I said, well, you be raising that one by yourself. I mean, I can't even imagine being 100 and having a baby. Can you? But they weren't complaining about it. See, Lenore and I, we may feel that way because we have 3. And we have grandkids on the way. But with children being such a joy, as Billy talked about this morning, being a man whose quiver is full, being that arrow that you get to shoot throughout their life at that target. If someone spent their whole life wanting one, I don't think they'd complain no matter what their age. And that indeed is the case with Abraham and Sarah. This is the joy, the crown jewel of their long lives. And now the boy's starting to grow older. It's that special time between a father and a son. He is the ultimate gift that God has bestowed upon Abram in his faithfulness. And now God comes to him. And he says, Abraham, verse 1, and Abraham responded, here I am. And God said to him, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. I think it's interesting that the text records those 3 words. Whom you love. If ever the Bible has an understatement, it may be those 3 words. The son whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. If there's ever a moment in Scripture that the Bible doesn't record, but just through common sense and our knowledge of humanity, we can see and feel the emotion of a man. Oh, how his heart must have sank. Oh, how he must have been filled with such dread and grief. But what I find to be perhaps one of the most amazing parts of the story is the next verse just says, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Where's the argument? Where's the debate? Where's the back and forth of demanding an explanation from God? And I've preached before about Abraham's life is really a dichotomy in some senses. It's a paradox in that it's really hard to pigeonhole Abraham, who he was, or God, even by some of our pre-constructed ideas about who God is in regard to His justice. Because when it came to Abraham, Abraham was his friend. And a few chapters before, in chapter 20, when Abraham lies to Abimelech, it just is one of the most difficult passages to put God in a box, because Abimelech, he doesn't do anything wrong. He takes Sarah as his wife because Abraham lies about it. And God comes and He says to Abimelech, I'm going to destroy you and your whole family. And Abimelech says, whoa, 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 why? What did I do wrong? He's the one that did the lying. And God says, all right, well, that's true. Paraphrasing. He says, you figured that out, I know. But God says, all right, if you go and you ask Him to pray for you. So in that situation, it's really hard to put God in a box, because you have a circumstance where Abraham does all the wrong, commits all the sin. And this other man does none of the wrong, commits none of the sin. He's the one that's going to be punished. And he ends up having to ask Abraham to bless him and pray for him. And Abraham leaves there twice as rich as he came. Because that just doesn't fit into a box of justice. But you know what it does fit into? Perfect fit into the box of friendship. God and Abraham had a special relationship. Because Abraham, and I'll tell you why. I don't have to wonder as to God's motivations or His justification in chapter 20 with Abimelech, because chapter 22 explains. Because I promise you, there wasn't a fellow named Abimelech that God says, go sacrifice the most precious thing that you have in the universe, and he doesn't even argue. He didn't even question. Although his heart is broken in two and agonizing, he just gets up early in the morning and saddles his donkey. As you read on in the text, you look at verse 8. Well, verse 7, Isaac said to Abraham his father and said, my father? Just even those words must have broke his heart, don't you think? Father? Here I am, son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, do you think his voice broke as he spoke to that little boy who just trusted his daddy? My son, God will provide for Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And the two of them went together. Then they came to the place which God had told him. And Abimelech built an altar, and Abraham, built an altar there and placed the wood on the altar. And he bound Isaac his son, and he laid him on the altar upon the wood. What do you think the boy's expression was? What's happening, Dad? He laid him on the altar, upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand. It doesn't say his shaking hand, but no doubt it was. And he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, here I am. That had to be the sweetest time his name had ever been called in his entire life. And he said, don't lay a hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you had not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, with that great Bible story as a background, let's turn to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. You see, this won't be the first time God has been offered a living sacrifice. Had this actually taken place, and it was never God's intention that it would, but simply for Abraham to demonstrate, and I don't think it's just for Abraham and just for God, I think it's for us. So we can be talking about that tonight at Sunday Night Live, all these thousands and thousands of years after the event. Because it is such a powerful picture. But you realize that Isaac was an original living sacrifice. That boy would grow up and he would become a prominent Bible character. He'd become married and he would have 2 sons. One of those sons would become the father of all the 12 tribes of Israel. But Isaac, throughout the rest of his life, from that time as a little boy, as he drew every breath of his life, he was a living sacrifice. Because he'd already been offered. You understand? God just didn't demand his life. But he had already, that life had already been turned over without reservation, without holding back, and without question. That life had already been turned over to God. And when it was, God offered a substitutionary sacrifice that did all the dying so that Isaac could do all the living. But it doesn't change the fact that Isaac was the offered one. He was the sacrifice. It's not much different than that which takes place in the life of every believer. Because as we enter into that grave, we studied extensively Romans chapter 6. That says, don't you know that as many of you as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? And having been buried with him through baptism into death, we rise to walk in newness of life. And Paul would say in Galatians, so clearly, he says, I have been crucified, sacrificed. I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. And here's the unique part. And gave himself for me. You see what happened at Calvary. And what happens every time. It happened twice this weekend. As 2 brothers were adopted into the royal family of God. What happened is a living sacrifice was offered. As they walked up into this baptistry, or as you walked down into the river years ago, or as you walked into a swimming pool, or whatever your own particulars may be, each and every one of us became a living sacrifice. We offered ourselves, and it has to be without question. And it has to be without reservation. And it has to be without argument. Because it has to be totally and completely. But here's the thing about our God. The gods of the pagans, when you look at the gods of the Egyptians, Ra, Nephti, and the gods of the Canaanites, Baal, Asherah, the gods of the Babylonians and the gods of the Assyrians, all of the gods that man has concocted and crafted of stone and wood, those gods all demanded human sacrifice. So does our God. The difference is our God demands your life, but He substitutes your death. You see? God doesn't want your death. Spiritually, He wants your life. He wants you to, the whole point is not that you die, it's that you be willing to. That you sacrifice yourself, that you give yourself to Him wholly and completely without reservation or argument. That's why, folks, conversion and teaching people the gospel, you can't manipulate someone into that. You can't argue with them into giving themselves without reservation on the altar. It has to be their choice. You see, God gave Abraham the test so Abraham would choose. To see what he would choose. And maybe the reason, and we get all sorts of arguments and debates about the necessity of baptism in the religious world. Maybe the reason that God has made it essential and so central to faith is because it is a moment of sacrifice. It's a moment of decision to say, without argument, without reservation, I give myself to you. I have been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ, were baptized into His death. And you see, in that moment, as we are there and we're buried underneath the water, God looks around and He sees a ram. But in our case, we call Him a lamb. And He does the dying, so that even though you have offered yourself, you can do the living. Present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. You see, Paul's not asking them something beyond or out of the norm of Christian faith. This is the very heart. This is the very essence of our faith. That we realize, and it is something that is a daily struggle, because as he goes on in verse 2, he says, and don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. He says, when you realize what you've chosen, when that is a reality for you, it must be remembered day after day after day. And it is transformative. And I wanted to introduce chapter 12 and all the riches of this great chapter that we'll explore over the next week or 2 weeks, or, well, we'll see how long it takes. With this idea, because I'll tell you, I am weary of all the debates and discussions and arguments and tracts and books and all of this that's been written, pro and con, up and down, about the importance or necessity of what takes place in that water. Because I'll tell you, when I look and I realize the importance of sacrifice and Paul's words, we have not done a good job of teaching people what that is all about. It's not just about, well, God said it and you got to do it. There's a why to it, folks. I mean, can you imagine what kind of daddy he would have been if his only motivation was, well, son, let's go up to the mountain. God said it. I got to do it. It's a checklist item. Not with my boy. How about you? That's what it was with Baal, Ra, and Asherah. No, we don't serve a God that wants our death. We serve a God who wants our life. But the only way he can really have it, completely, holy, through and through, is if we're willing to sacrifice ourselves. That's what I had to say tonight. And it was kind of short. Bonus. Tonight, if there's anybody here who you've not yet put your life on the altar, here's the good news. It ain't about dying. Somebody died so you could. But for you, it's about living. Living as a living sacrifice. And it is a big decision. It's the only decision in life that really matters. It is a change. As he says in verse 2, it is a transformation. Because it's about living, but it's not about living for you. It's about living every day for Him. If you need to come right now as we stand and sing.